Welcome to another edition of Daily Airline News, focusing on the tragic loss of Air India 171. I'm Geoffrey Thomas, and I'm delighted to say joined by my co-host Richard Godfrey in Frankfurt, Germany. Good morning to you, Richard.
And good afternoon, Geoffrey.
So viewers, this episode is called Engine Shutdown, and today a viewer is writing the introduction. The San Diegan says, the majority of my career has been spent in the field of multivariate analysis and quantitative process management in a systems engineering environment. It is critical to view the cascade of failure as a sequence of individual events and associated data points, each with their own associated probability of occurrence and associated causality. Then, in aggregate, defining the best fit explanation, taking the causal relationships of each event into consideration. Taking all publicly available data into consideration, a clear sequence of events begins to emerge. This includes the timeline, now incorporating the initial time-stamped exchange between the pilot flying and the pilot monitoring, as reported by the Times of India. The cockpit voice recorder, CVR, shows that the fuel cutoff switches for engines 1 and 2 were actuated in sequence at the same cadence typically used when shutting down the aircraft at the gate. This action occurred just 3 or 4 seconds after the aircraft's air-ground sensors indicated it was airborne. That moment also coincides with when the landing gear would normally be retracted. However, the gear was never raised. 1 second after the fuel switches were moved to the cutoff position, the co-pilot is heard asking why the fuel was cut off. He repeats this question in the next 6 seconds, indicating confusion and lack of situational clarity. Critically, 10 full seconds passed before engine 1 fuel cutoff switch was returned to the run position. It took another 4 seconds before the engine 2 switch was re-engaged. Taken together, these facts construct a probability tree where one explanation stands out as significantly more likely than any alternative. This is before taking into account that according to the Times, the captain only had 3 flights remaining following this outbound flight. Ask yourself, had the act not been deliberate, then why did it take 10 full seconds to return the cutoff switches to the run position? It would have been the pilot monitoring's responsibility to raise the gear, as the pilot flying would have had both hands on the yoke at that critical stage of flight. It must be noted that the actuation of the fuel cutoff switches occurred at the approximate time when the gear would have been raised. Had the captain simply suffered a terminal brain fart in the moment, there is a precedent of this happening, and for some reason actuated the fuel cutoff switches instead of the landing gear, he would have immediately taken corrective action. Instead, we know that for a full 10 seconds, the pilot flying, who again had both hands on the yoke, simply repeated the question, while no corrective action was taken. I would imagine it was the pilot flying who eventually returned the switches to the run position with a 4-second delay because he had to briefly return his left hand to the yoke. Which brings me to my final observation. We have an actual witness to what occurred in the cockpit, as evidenced by the CVR and the horrific testimony he provided by way of his last words as this tragedy unfolded in real time. Richard.
Yeah, well, I think it's a fabulous analysis from San Diegan, and he gets to the heart of the matter. Most observers, meanwhile, accept that the fuel switches were physically and mechanically moved. And most observers also accept the timing from the preliminary report, although they point out it is only given to the nearest second and it's not entirely precise. We're showing a screenshot that we published I think, for the first time on the 12th of July. So it's now 10 days out of date. But we went through the timing sequence from air mode transition through the engine fuel switches being moved from run to cutoff, and then back to run, and then back on engine one, and then on engine two. The fuel switches were both moved from run to cutoff at 08:08:43. The left fuel switch, engine one, was moved to cutoff to run on 08:08:52, 9 seconds later. And the right fuel switch, engine two, was moved from cutoff to run at 08:08:56, another 4 seconds later. And the key question is, why did it take so long?
So, Richard, we get back to the question, is whether these actions were deliberate or accidental.
Well, most observers now accept that the switch actions were deliberate. The San Diegan, in his analysis, talks about a brain fart, by which he means a temporary mental lapse or failure to think clearly, such as the British Airways incident we described in a previous episode on cognitive disorder. It was episode 155, where the first officer momentarily mixed up his left hand on the throttle with his right hand on the yoke. And the San Diegan points out the switch action occurred just 3 seconds after the aircraft air ground sensors indicated the aircraft was airborne. And that moment coincides with the moment where you would be moving the landing gear lever and selecting gear up. And it would then result in the landing gear being retracted. However, we know for a fact that landing gear was not retracted. So we have all experienced, I'm sure, other people or even ourselves, for example, forgetting our phone number when asked, or calling someone by the wrong name, or misplacing your keys while you actually got them in your hand. I mean, I'm capable of going into the kitchen and then when I get there, reminding myself, why did I come to the kitchen and what is it I was wanting to do? So, brain fart or momentary lapses can happen. I would also add my mother used to suffer from what is known as TIAs. And these are small brain damages that sometimes an episode would last just a second or two, sometimes a whole minute. But these things can happen.
Yeah, so they certainly can. And I think we can all relate to that, including going looking for your glasses when they're actually perched on top of your head. So let's not go there. So the question then is, what was the intent of the deliberate action?
Exactly. And was the intent to try and save the aircraft, or was the intent to try and crash the aircraft? And I can see a number of viewers putting forward arguments in both directions. The fact is that both engine relights were successful. So the engines did shut down, but they were relit. And because the relight was successful, the engines did not fail or have any significant damage to them. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to do an engine relight. We also note the aircraft managed to glide around 1,620 meters from the highest point reached, and that's just over a mile. And you don't glide a mile if you're trying to crash an aircraft. So, we are informed from a reliable source that the engine shutdown was due to the fuel switches being moved from run to cutoff. And on the other hand, San Diegan says, ask yourself, had the act not been deliberate, then why did it take 10 full seconds to return the cutoff switches to the run position?
Uh, there are so many questions, Richard, aren't there? There's so many questions. So,
Yes, and people are also saying, how could we not come to a conclusion? I mean, in the midst of so many questions, I don't think you can come to a conclusion.
well, we've said from the very outset, and I think obviously a lot of our viewers don't necessarily see all the episodes or all the way through. We've always maintained that we just want to deal with the facts, and certainly we can offer a hypothesis, a theory, not speculation. And we sort of, I know there's possibly a fine line between the two, but what we try and do is build a hypothesis based on facts, not speculation. So Richard, why did it take between 9 and 13 seconds?
Yeah, well, that is the key question. And I think it is revealing to go through that analysis. Now, first thing is we know from a reliable source close to the investigation that the reason the engines shut down was solely because the fuel switches were moved from run to cutoff. And this is contrary to what should happen if you observe an engine shutdown for any other reason than switching the fuel off. I mean, there are many possible reasons why an engine may shut down: a compressor stall, for example, or a bird strike, or a fuel contamination. So in this case, the pilot, if he observed in the ICAS an engine shutdown, the Boeing procedure tells him to leave the switches in the run position and not touch them. But we are clearly told in the report, in the preliminary report, that both switches were moved within around 1 second from the run to the cutoff position, and then they were moved back from the cutoff to the run position, one after 9 seconds and the other after 13 seconds. And we're showing a screenshot of a second by second timeline of the engine shutdown. And in the absence of any CVR or FDR or ATC full data, we're only given small excerpts of that data, it would appear to me that this was not a deliberate action to crash the aircraft, but more the brain fart type action, or perhaps even a panic reaction, as the NTSB allude to. And it was not following the standard emergency procedure. So
Mm.
let me walk you through the key points in the screenshot, and I will post a link to it in the description below. The timeline starts with liftoff, when the mode transition from ground to air, the climb begins, acceleration begins, and then at 08:08:42, the left engine fuel switch is switched from run to cutoff, and then within a second later, the right engine. And as San Diego points out, will be sort of the typical sequence on the ground at the end of a flight when you shut down the engines. And then 1 second later, you get one pilot saying, "Why did he cut off?" And the other one saying, "He did not do so." And then we have the thrust rapidly decaying, evidence from the N1, N2, and fuel flow falling. Then we have the rat deploying, we have the descent beginning. And Then we go quite a few seconds later before at 08:08:52, the left engine fuel switch is moved back to run. And finally, at 08:08:56, the right engine moved back to run. And we note the preliminary report says when the fuel switches were found in the wreckage, they were found in the run position.
Mm. Yeah, quite a dramatic sequence of events, Richard.
It is, and you have to go through very carefully before you come to any conclusion about was this deliberate or accidental? I think it was deliberate. Was it intentional or unintentional? And I
Mm.
think the jury's still out on that question.
Yeah, indeed. It's interesting that we sit here discussing this and everybody else is discussing it, and we discuss it over an hour or half an hour and analyze it and say, why didn't you do this or why did you do that? But the reality, this is just 30 something seconds. You
Yeah,
know, it's
yeah, 32 seconds. And you can imagine when all of this is going on, how many ICAS messages are being
oh,
displayed? How many warnings are going off? How many red lights or amber lights are being shown? And how many oral indications are being heard in the cockpit? So, getting the actual cockpit voice recorder audio would be probably a nightmare to listen to.
it would probably be absolutely frightening to listen to it. And you didn't have to wonder what on earth you would do, and how you would, handle it all.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, viewers, that's all we've got time for today. I know we said we were taking a day off, but we're not, as you can obviously see. And we're going to be back tomorrow. We haven't quite decided what we're going to talk about tomorrow, but I think we're going to be looking at your questions, and also touching on some fake news that's floating around at the moment as well. And we'll look at that particular aspect. So, Richard, thank you very much indeed for all the work you've done on this. It's just terrific and really an amazing analysis. And so, thank you. And
You're welcome.
viewers, please subscribe to us. Please like us. Please keep those comments coming. We love them. And of course, keep those fabulous questions coming. They're absolutely fantastic and so pleasing that we've got so many real professional people coming to the YouTube channel, as well as some amazing amateur sleuths as well, who are really turning up some interesting dynamics to this terrible tragedy. So please tune in tomorrow. Thank you.